I think for countries like France and Germany, they take pride in their educational systems and they take history seriously. But the narrative that they're taught of European history is very much a West European story. And when East Europe comes in, it's usually in the form of Russia or the Soviet Union. And so people can be very well educated without having ever really come into contact with Ukraine. And for most people, if you don't learn it as a child, you don't learn it at all. So and the second point is that the reality of Ukraine has been actively suppressed. So by Soviet propaganda, by an overarching Russian imperial narrative, which was brought to France and other countries by white Russian immigrants. So there's a funny way in that precisely because Ukraine is so important, people tell Westerners that doesn't really exist, that really belongs to us. Because Ukraine really is important. I mean, it's central. And I guess this is a third point. It's not just that the French and other Europeans learn that, oh yes, there is a Ukraine. Like, it's not just a yes/no question. It's also that they have so much to learn after they learn that, right? Not just that there is a Ukraine that exists, but oh, Ukraine was a crucial part of the Soviet Union. Oh yes, wait a minute, it was also part of Poland. And hold on, it was also part of the Habsburg monarchy. And wait a minute, it was part of the Russian Empire. And hold on, the Russian Empire only became European after it absorbed Ukraine. And wait a minute, when it absorbed Ukraine, it absorbed churchmen who belonged to a culture that had been going on for hundreds of years. And hold on, that brings us back to Rus. And wait, Rus connects us to the Vikings. And oh, look, the Vikings connect us to another globalization. And you can keep going back and back and back, hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of years. And you keep finding new layers of human, European, Ukrainian history in these lands. So the positive side of this is that some people, once they realize that Ukraine exists, they make a kind of voyage, and they learn some of these things. And for me personally, the interesting part is that Ukrainian history doesn't have to be just a defensive thing. Of course, it's very annoying when people don't know you exist. But the positive way to look at it is that once people know that Ukraine exists, actually their own histories make more sense. Their own histories make more sense. Like France was ruled for a time by the Goths. Who were the Goths? They were people who came from Ukraine. Medieval France had this strange queen that people have forgotten about called Anne. Where did she came from? Well, like an awful lot of important women in medieval European history, she came from Rus, she came from Kiev, and on and on and on. So in many different ways, European history really only makes sense when you start to put Ukraine into it. And that's a kind of positive project that I want to take part in. Well, we just had a nice little chat about how central Ukraine is culturally. Ukraine is also central strategically. And this is, again, an easy point to make historically, that Ukraine has been at the center of various contests, going all the way back to the Greeks and probably before, trying to control Ukrainian agricultural resources, trying to control the Black Sea, and trying to control Ukrainian human resources is a story which has at least a couple thousand years of history and maybe more. In modern history, the First World War was largely about Ukraine. The Second World War was chiefly about Ukraine. The Soviet Union existed in the form that it did for as long as it did because it managed to control Ukraine. And so the question of what Ukraine is, or where Ukraine is, by whom it is controlled, has been very, very, very important. And we now have we've had this very special opportunity for the last 34 years to see Ukraine be an independent state, right? And that independent state, if it is secure, if it is prosperous, will help Europe to be the Europe that it wants to be. And I think it has to be seen in that way. I think too often Europeans see Ukraine as an irritant, or Ukraine is a place that needs our help. But it's really the other way around. If the European Union is going to survive and thrive, it has to include Ukraine. And this has been my view for quite a long time. But the Russians have made it all the clearer. If Russia manages to control that territory and those people, and this, of course, it's a terrible thing to think about, but if Russia manages to control that territory and those resources, then Russia is an existential threat to Europe in a way that it wasn't before. And if one now imagines in 2025 a Russia which is powerful like that, and then America which is totally absent and indifferent to Europe, which is what Americans are here in Munich telling you, then that is a very dark picture for Europe. So Ukraine, in a way, is Europe's chance to be itself, and I just worry that Europeans aren't going to see that quickly enough. So for me, I mean, as a historian, I can say, not just about Ukrainians, but in general, that belonging to a nation, I think, is more about the future than about the past. Belonging to a nation means that you believe that in the future you'll be doing something together with this large group of people, most of whom you don't know personally, and that kind of understood commitment, or at least understood co-belonging to a future, often has something to do with the past, but it's very hard to tease out exactly what it has to do with the past. I certainly don't think that there's any kind of simple story where you say, like, I'm Ukrainian today because my grandparents were Ukrainian, their grandparents were Ukrainian, because at some point that just stops being true, right? And for many Ukrainians, it's actually already with the grandparents. So it has to. So the past certainly has something to do with it, but I think it's more like the past supplies materials from which people build their personalities, and it provides possibilities, and one of those possibilities is a sense of belonging to a nation. So first of all, in general, statues go up and statues go down. And like, that's just true. It happens. And it will never be completely just. Like, the statue going up is also always a little bit tricky, and the statue going down is also never perfect. And this is true not only in Ukraine, but in lots of other countries at the same time. I guess what I would say is that it's important not to just conveniently push things aside, but rather to rework them. So not all monuments are going to continue to be monuments, but certainly, for example, the history of Ukrainians in the Red Army is an organic part of a lot of histories of families, and there are many other examples like that. And it doesn't do to just deny that ever happened, or pretend it didn't exist. It has to be rethought, but in some kind of honest way.